Hello, and welcome to Cyberbible 2.0, Episode 3, an online Bible study sponsored by Union United Methodist Church of Quincy, Illinois. I'm Bob Morwell, pastor of the church. We're continuing with our study of the Gospel according to Luke, and we'll take up with the events beginning at chapter 1, verse 39. You're welcome to read along by going to Bible Gateway and looking up the New International Version of the Gospel. As I noted earlier, two of the Gospels, Mark and John, contain no accounts of Jesus' birth, and Matthew and Luke have different takes on what happened. In Luke's version, Mary is very much the focus of attention. In addition to her giving birth to the Christ, a member of her extended family, Elizabeth, is said to be the mother of John the Baptist, and shortly after becoming pregnant, Mary goes to stay with her for an extended period of time. Joseph is only passingly mentioned in the entire first chapter of Luke's Gospel. Matthew, on the other hand, gives a much more prominent role to Joseph, the carpenter of Nazareth, whose family lineage he lists almost immediately and in great detail. Part of this difference is attributable to the audiences toward whom these books were addressed. Luke was clearly writing for people like himself, who came to the faith from a non-Jewish background. Matthew was, in all probability, a Jewish-born Christian, who was writing for other Jews whom he was seeking to convince that Jesus was their long-awaited Messiah. For Matthew, it was essential to immediately establish Jesus' identity as a descendant of David, which was something that was expected of the Messiah. At the same time, he also had to quickly deal with the issue of Jesus' legitimacy in the eyes of Jewish law and custom. Consequently, he points out that Joseph is a man of piety, whose first inclination was to reject the unexpectedly pregnant Mary, but who abandoned that plan only after intervention of a messenger from God assuring him that the child was holy. Matthew then insists that Joseph went ahead and married Mary before the child was born. Luke's version of the story is a bit different. Joseph's struggle with Mary's out-of-wedlock pregnancy is not mentioned at all. And in the next chapter, when we get to the birth of the child, Mary and Joseph are still described as betrothed rather than married. The bottom line appears to be that Matthew and Luke differ on this point, though both agree that Mary was a virgin at the time of his conception via the Holy Spirit. For many, this is an essential article of faith. For others, a bit of a stumbling block. A friend and colleague of mine observed that he didn't think anyone comes to believe in Jesus because of the virgin birth. After all, Islam also claims that he was born of a virgin, but the Quran vehemently denies that he is God's son. My friend noted that folks who believe in Jesus' virgin birth come to accept his divinity for other reasons first. In other words, they choose to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin because they already believe he is divine, rather than the other way around. We do know that around the time that these accounts were being written, another story was making the rounds that Jesus was the product of a relationship between a Galilean prostitute named Mary and a Roman soldier named Pantera. This version was spread by people seeking to discredit Jesus and his movement. The implication was that the child of such a union would be far too spiritually corrupted to be a legitimate prophet, much less the Messiah. Frankly, there's no evidence to corroborate this story, but skeptics will quickly rush to note that there's no independent verification of the gospel accounts of Jesus' conception either. There's no evidence that Jesus insisted on belief in his virgin birth as a prerequisite for salvation. And inasmuch as neither Mark nor John nor the apostles Peter or Paul made mention of it, I just don't see this as an issue upon which our redemption rests. They didn't seem to either. This is not a denial of the virgin birth. It's simply putting it in perspective. The same is true concerning the marital status of Mary and Joseph at the time of his birth. In some ways, depicting Jesus as an out-of-wedlock child fits with one of Luke's major themes in both the Gospel and the book of Acts. The arc of his narrative is God embracing and including people who have been thought outside the covenant, people who have been marginalized, rejected, and despised. The focus on Mary reflects this. Luke's gospel has more prominent female characters than any other, and women are certainly oppressed and marginalized in that time. A peasant child born out of wedlock, who is also God's chosen instrument for redeeming and retrieving those who are lost and rejected, would fit that narrative and this primary theme of his gospel. It would resonate with Luke's Gentile audience, who often saw the Jewish people with their claims of being chosen and especially loved by the God who created the whole world as exclusionary and rather self-righteous. This would have caused special struggle for a class of people who were known as the God-fearers. These were Gentiles who were drawn to belief in the God of Israel, but who balked at such requirements as circumcision and the kosher dietary laws which were required of and by Jews. The Gentile God-fearers were moved by the Jewish God's emphasis on justice and mercy, but blocked by both their own issues with ritual observance and the attitudes of some Jews even toward converts. Even if they did submit to all the rules and the regs, they were often seen by some Jews as second class. That God would choose to work through a man whom many of those more self-righteous Jews would deem inferior and spiritually damaged goods would appeal to the God-fearers, who were certainly among the first Gentile converts to Christianity. This theme of inclusion of the rejected and outcast would figure very prominently in Mary's meeting with her pregnant relative Elizabeth. Instead of immediately marrying Joseph after getting word of her pregnancy, Luke says that she rushed to Judea, many miles to the south, to stay with Elizabeth. It was not at all uncommon in those times for an inconveniently pregnant young woman to have to leave town. Was this part of the reason Mary left Nazareth? It doesn't say. But such a trip would not have been surprising. It would be a way to escape some of the gossip and judgment that would come her way, perhaps even from Joseph, who was left wondering what to do. Luke says that when Mary and Elizabeth meet, the unborn child leaps in Elizabeth's womb in recognition of the coming of the one whose arrival the adult John will proclaim. Elizabeth tells Mary, who responds with an extraordinary and powerful proclamation that has come to be known as the Magnificat, which comes from the Latin term magnify, as in my soul magnifies or glorifies the Lord. Many scholars believe that this was actually an early hymn of the church. The theme could be described as revolutionary. I'm not talking about a violent or Marxist-style revolution, but it is about radically altering the social order. Mary speaks joyfully of the powerful and the proud being toppled from their positions of privilege and the humble and hungry being lifted up by God. The coming of this child signals a challenge to the power structures in which the rich and connected seek to increase their privileges at the expense of the poor and powerless. The notion that the good news has no political implications simply fails to take into account the transformative power of the gospel. Social institutions that thrive on and promote oppression come under the judgment of God and are to be changed. Mary is not exalting mere charity for those who are getting shafted by the system. She's proclaiming in a voice that echoes the prophets that the systems that promote injustice will be overthrown by the coming of God's kingdom. The humiliated and the hungry will be lifted up. And a prime actor in all of this transformation will be a barely teenaged, illiterate peasant girl whose pregnancy is a cause of gossip and scandal, whose standing in her society was roughly that of a slave, and whose word would not be deemed acceptable in a court of law at the time. Even in the synagogue, she would have had to sit behind a screen because women were deemed spiritually inferior to men. And yet the child she carries would become the most revered figure in the history of the world. It's not what anyone would have expected of someone with such preposterously humble origins. When the ragtag army of the United States accepted the surrender of British forces at Yorktown at the end of what had initially seemed an impossible revolution, the British band played a song entitled "The World Turned Upside Down." It must have seemed that way to the shocked and humbled superpower of the 18th century. This is what Mary is talking about, and what the early church sang about. It is change that is personal, to be sure. It requires transformation of the individual soul and courageous commitment. That is what is required of Mary, but it does not stop there. It is change that is global in scope. More to come. This concludes the third episode of Cyberbible 2.0. You can link to other episodes through our Facebook page or our website. I'm Bob Morwell, pastor of Union United Methodist Church in Quincy. I invite your comments and questions, and you're always welcome to visit us in the real world. Peace.